Hello everyone, my name is Scott Shershow and I'm a professor in the English department here at UC Davis. I'm going to be speaking about this piece by Ajit Chauhan, if I'm pronouncing the name correct. And I should stipulate I have no real expertise on this artist or this piece. In fact, I had never heard of him. I believe he's about a 30-year-old artist before agreeing to give a few words on it. And I have to admit, I first saw this piece in the form of a photograph of it, and the first thing that came into my head, as I acknowledged with maybe a little bit of embarrassment, were the lyrics of a rather silly old pop song, "These boots are made for walking." And that's just what they'll do. One of these days, these boots are going to walk all over you. It's a wonderful song because, of course, it tries to present itself as very aggressive and assertive, but it's really quite ambivalent since you can't walk over the person and walk away at the same time. But, of course, I digress. I might, in justification for this comparison, invoke a famous classical principle of criticism, in the words of the Roman poet Horace, ut pictura poesis, that is, that art, visual art, pictures, and sculpture should be something like poetry, and vice versa. But I think it's fair to say that that principle is perhaps not particularly applicable here. For one thing, and perhaps most obviously, these are not, in fact, boots. Not in any sense at all, and not only in the fundamental sense that these objects are, of course, no real object at all, but what we call an object of art. But rather what I mean is, what is even being represented here is in fact, at least appears to be, two pairs of feet and legs with socks, loafers, and perhaps a little bit of trouser, although one can almost not quite be sure about that. Nevertheless, and especially when I first saw them in 3 dimensions, and when I look at them again now, my mind still irresistibly wants to think boot. At some level, I know, although not really, I don't know this as a matter of real fact, but I can only assume that these must be casts of something. Casts probably of some real feet and shoes that therefore probably, or even certainly, exist somewhere else still today. So these things before us are, as it were, the mark or the trace of a container that once contained something else. The impression that these are boots, a container for feet, is then compounded, at least for me, because the presentation of all 4 of them, or really here all 8 of them, 2 related pieces, is perhaps intended to suggest, it was another of my first impressions, that they've been mounted, with a sort of studied style and casualness in the window of a fancy shoe store. But of course, I still haven't even mentioned the main reason that these objects manage to be at once very insistently familiar and yet rather uncanny and strange, and that's because they're, in fact, cast in wax. I don't think I knew that when I saw them in a photograph, so it was yet another level of apprehension of the piece when I first saw the real thing. And one grasps that they're made of wax, and there's a certain vertigo or queasiness about it, I think, because the material itself now seems extremely strange, and it forces one perhaps to imagine that these things maybe were candles, that they had wicks on top of them, and one imagines them aflame so that they would literally sort of burn up and finally melt away into nothingness. And then perhaps we would be in the presence of something, or thinking this, very different than I've suggested so far. Almost a kind of memento mori, an intimation of mortality, as though these strange boots, if I can still call them that, were inviting us